Today, in the short and abbreviated time, we're going to have a look at all the tools are available inside of Houdini to do oceans and ocean simulations. First off, we have to start talking about what can we do with just ocean surfaces. And we have a complete set of tools that can take any surface, any polygon surface, whatever shape it is, and we can generate oceans from those surfaces. So for instance, if you've got a lake that's cut out of some islands, you can take that polygon or that mesh that defines the lake, and then you can scatter points on it, and then you can do ocean, generate your FFTs and do your oceans on top of it. So what we have here is a set of tools to generate realistic oceans. And it's designed for flexibility and scalability. So that means it's all node based. You can go in there and you can change things. You can add, remove different components and build your own feature set to do your own oceans. We can do an unlimited layering of ocean spectra via points. At the time we were very unique. It's nice to see other tools out there coming up that also give you the same sort of flexibility. And also we use points. We use point clouds scattered on the surfaces themselves to define where we want to have these different waveforms and wave directions. And we use just the standard old school Houdini attributes for point instancing, particle scale, which is p scale, velocity or normal as the direction of the waveform, and also up. What's the up direction of the wave? So by using those attributes on the points, we can have complete control. So here's a quick show showing the scattered points, generating the FFTs based on those points. And so it's a point-driven type of a workflow. And you can actually layer multiple levels of points. So you can have some points that are very few points that generate large waves, and then you can have a second SOP underneath it that generates more smaller points to generate and these really complicated layered FFT waveforms that you can then do render time surfacing inside, all inside of our shading language called VEX. So, and here's just a fun, this is literally off the shelf. Just put down a grid from the camera to the horizon, put in an HDR image, and then just rendering the default scattering of the points on the surface. This is using our own render engine, Mantra. We have ways of generating texture maps as well to support other render engines. But if you know Mantra, it does an excellent job of displacements, and it actually has adaptive displacements as well, where if the frequency gets too high, you can also turn on bumping. It's a default toggle on all of our shaders. So now, what else can you do with this? This is the same thing. Remember what I said at first, any surface, scatter your points, and your points have a local coordinate system. In this case, it's really trivial to do this. We just have a surface that's in a coil. We scatter our points on it, but those points will inherit the surface normal from the actual underlying surface as the up direction. And the velocity vector we just set in the direction of the curve or whatever you want to do with it. So scattering points will inherit that from the surface, and then we use those points to just animate the FFTs as well. So really easy to extend this to do pretty much anything. And here's a simple example of what the SOP network looks like. We have just a basic grid going into the Ocean Evaluate node. And the Ocean Evaluate node then has two ocean spectrum. And you can see one has, and the ocean spectrum node itself internally is a digital asset. So if you dive inside of it, we're actually generating our own localized point cloud as well. So there's tools on top of the ocean spectrum that allow us to determine how dense to scatter the points or how little to scatter, plus complete control over the randomness or directionality of the waveforms themselves. And we can change the uniform scale, the grid spacing, and we can even use height fields as well as a way of generating the surface maps. We can also mask out areas that we want to have certain areas to have a lower ocean spectrum and other ones have a higher ocean spectrum. And we have nice controls to blend between the two as well. So you have a radial blur on top of that. So already a lot of control. Now, some of the things that we're thinking about in this, and you can see here we can do radial control of the surfaces, and that's it. Now, one of the things that we are looking at doing is looking at machines, machine learning, to add even more types of control to the waves. If we can teach these ocean tools to generate the waves based on points with particular FFTs, and we train it that this is the type of wave it generates. Let the machine do the work for us. And also, given that, we can then teach this machine to generate all kinds of other types of waves, maybe Kelvin wakes from boats, or other sort of characteristic waveforms that you would see on your oceans. So that's sort of the ideas that we're looking at as well. And here's another example of using the Ocean Toolkit, but this time we're going to be scattering points on the surface grid. And these points will inherit all the attributes off your surface, including surface normal, directionality. If you've used the comb sop to comb your normals, you can then use that, and you have complete control over your point cloud, the same control that you have over the points that are inside the ocean spectrum. Then you can create a second copy, and you can actually decrease or increase the speed. So you can have multiple speeds of different waves on top of your ocean, and you can have low frequency waves, and then you can have high frequency waves on it, and you can even add some different waves. And you can see here, we actually are using that p-scale attribute, which is the particle scale attribute, to determine the radial of influence of those points on the surface. So obviously, the smaller the points, the smaller the p-scale, the larger the points, the broader you want the waves. If you just want to have a single FFT, just put a single point in the middle and make the radius really large. And then you get basically what we had before we implemented this, which is just a single FFT. Now, what makes this really important is that if we can tie this into our flip solver, in other words, inherit the boundary of the fluid or use the surface itself as an influencer on the flip fluids, then we have a really cool system. And that's exactly what we have here. So this Ocean Toolkit will create all the attributes and all the data that we need, including the surface field, to actually use this as a way, as a waterline or as an influencer for our flip fluids, which we'll take a look at a bit later on. But just realize that this tool is turnkey right into our flip solver as well. And here's some more ocean spectrum workflow. In this case, we can use curves. We have a tool that allows you to take curves to sculpt any waves. Obviously, this is not giving you breaking waves, but it definitely gives you a start. And if you put this into our flip tools, you can actually have directable flip waves as well. And this is what we're doing. We basically just have curves that we just lifted up the plane so you can see what they're happening. So we're basically using the curves to define an FFT, or a waveform that then goes through already an underlying bulk of waves. Now, another thing you'll notice is that in this particular case, this is just showing you the waves going in a direction, in a ring, and nothing could be easier. It's basically just fire up Houdini, put your grid down, put down a comb sop, and comb your normals in a circle. Then you scatter your points, and you put those points into the Ocean Evaluate, and or Ocean Spectrum, and then you put it into Ocean Evaluate, and guess what? Your waves are now going in a circle pattern. It's nothing easier than that. So you can comb your original directions, you can sculpt your original directions, and whatever velocities or normals are present, they'll be used to determine the directionality of the waves. Now, if you're a Houdini user and you're doing simulation with flip fluids, this is a flip fluid simulation, you definitely want to use height fields. Height fields as colliders and flip fluids is now the norm. If you use a polygonal surface as your collider, or just a regular volume like a VDB grid or one of our volumes, the simulation will run not nearly as fast as it was run with the height fields. Height fields are supported natively in Flip, so definitely use them as colliders. Another thing is, now that we got our ocean tools, we need to have a really nice way of generating foam, spray, and bubbles. And we also have those tools as well. We even have a complete set of tools that work with our Ocean Toolkit to generate the foam and the spray. That also works with using our flip fluids as well. And you can see here that it's camera frustum based if you wish it to be, and it works quite well. It works as a layer on top of the ocean, so you do your ocean sim first, or you generate your ocean sim, your ocean surfaces, your flip sim, and then you apply your spray after that. So each one of those different tools will create the right data. And when you combine both the foam and the Ocean Toolkit together, you now get really nice solutions. And here's some early tests that Scott Keating did. This was about a year and a half ago. We fixed the boat in a penetration issue, by the way. So we fixed that. And you can see here some more render settings that you can get with scale as you zoom in and zoom out. So it's really nice. And a nice close-up of the boat on the water again. So it holds up very well. Holds up very well for doing a lot of basic water simulations if you're doing broad water simulations. And some more work at that. Now with the whitewater system, we actually have a lot of control. as to where and how to distribute the fluid, the stretchiness, the stringiness, whether you drive from the peaks from the velocity or dial it off. So there's a lot of different controls. And with the PDG that we introduced in 17.5, it's really nice and friendly to do a lot of wedging on those tests. Now we're going into flip fluids. So we have the Whitewater Ocean Toolkit. The SOPs that I showed you, that's as hard as it gets, basically. Now we need to get into flip fluids because we want to be able to do localized simulations on top of our broader ocean tools. And for that, we'll turn to flip. And flip has got a bunch of different features to confuse us. One of them is we have narrowband solver, which we definitely want to use for oceans. We have the ability to do air entrapment. Probably don't want that, but it's there. We actually have a really cool optical flow, and so we have physically correct simulation for compressible fluids if you want to do fluid containers in that. And yes, this will work with foam and spray if you want to enable those features inside of here. But it's very fast, OpenCL accelerated solver, and you can do such things as pouring liquid. So if I had to pour some liquids into a tank of water, yeah, you can do that as well. And also we have air entrapment and viscosity, so this is combining both. So just showing you some of the capabilities that we have. And also variable viscosity. It's a very powerful tool inside of the flip solver. You can actually paint the viscosity values on the surfaces, and the fluid will inherit that for doing variable viscosity. And also we have surface tension. If you need that, surface tension actually got a nice update in 17.0. I don't think we publicized that, but there's a nice update in surface tension in 17.0, and we're looking at even better models for surface tension moving forward. So we're always trying to find better ways to improve our flip surface. And also there's air entrapment in there as well. Do we need that for oceans? Maybe we're generating a big suction machine. So, you know, these are the general set of toolkits that we supply effects artists to be able to do enterprise visual effects work. So yeah, maybe you have to do a big sucking machine that then blows the water out veins, and you can do that as a single coupled solve if you want, or do it all combined in the same solve if you really like pain and a lot of longer solve times. So giving you all these tools. Another tool that we added is air entrapment to doing bubbles. Again, we're looking at even improving this as well. You can see the bubbles agitate the surface. That's built in off the shelf. So we actually have shelf tools expressed for everything that I've shown so far. And also something we added very recently in 17.0 is custom field advection. So now by default, all of our fluid solvers can advect any attribute, including color, natively by support. So now we get really nice mixing of color. So of course, if you want to introduce blood or some other sort of liquid inside of your fluid to do your simulation, you can easily do that now. And you can see the nice mixing of the fluids. And also there's this notion of coupling simulations as well. It's always an issue inside of Houdini. The flipped fluid solver is not really coupled with Vellum at this point in time, but the two do transfer enough information that allows you to do these sorts of really cool enterprise effects. It requires a little bit of trickery and a little bit of passing of data between the solvers, but it's more than possible. And I can keep on going on and on about all the various different options that we can couple flip fluids to different things. Flip can also be used to do highly, highly viscous type simulations as well. And what's important about this is that if we have to have something that's rubbery, that interacts with water, with our flip fluids, we can now define, because we also have support for variable density, variable viscosity, advection of different types of attributes, we can now introduce very rubbery, fleshy-like objects inside of our water tank, and that would be a fully coupled sim sharing the same substeps within the same simulation. So these things are more than possible. As a side tangent, in 17.0, as part of the Vellum toolkit, we actually added this really cool node called the particle, or the like a pop solver SOP, or the water solver SOP, and it's a DOP, particle fluid DOP. The particle fluid DOP, and we use that to do condensation. So we added a condensation type solver in 17.5 as well. And you can use the pop fluid DOP as a layer on top of your flip fluids as well, in the point side of the flip fluids. Now on to more things that you would want to do with flip fluids, such as doing the flip solver. We have a suction force tool, which is great for sucking water out of surfaces. And you can use that to suck into characters. So if you had to do characters that basically suck water like water monsters. It's right off the shelf these days. And what we do is we apply suction force. As long as you can turn your animated character into a sequence of VDB grids that are pretty much manifold, guaranteed at that point in time, you can actually use that as a suction force to fill the object up. And some more examples of that, different pressure settings of the suction force. Now we're coming to the really important part of binding our ocean surfaces with flip fluids. And that has to do with something that we introduced called a waterline. Now what the waterline is there's a boundary around each one of these flip tanks. And we use this receding type algorithm whereby we're constantly replenishing the fluid around the container. And we don't see it here, but there's a bit of churn all around this container as it goes, as it's trying to keep the water in place. So what we added is this thing called a waterline. So you can see here left, it looks like the water is reflecting off a wall. On the right-hand side, though, what we've done is we've added a waterline at the 0 level, or whatever level you want that you want the waterline to be at. And what happens is the water will now slosh over that waterline. So we have a flat, in this particular case, there's a flat waterline around this object. And that flat waterline now allows us to run the fluid a lot closer with not getting that glass wall effect. And what's important about that is that waterline has a fixed thickness to it, a bandwidth. And that bandwidth has a slider on it. Please use that. And the waterline can also be driven by any surface. So instead of just having an infinite plane define our waterline, we can use any surface to find that waterline. And one of those surfaces can be an ocean surface. And if we do define an ocean surface as the waterline, what happens is this water will now use that surrounding ocean surface to actually define where the water gets pumped in and where the water gets pumped out via receding. So it's a really important thing, this waterline. Now here we have a simple simulation of flip fluids. This time it's narrowband. I resimmed this as narrowband, which we now added in 17.5. We now have narrowband support for pretty much any type of river or ocean surface now. It's very flexible. And you can see here the water line is exposed there and there. So this is actually being receding. So we're actually using the receding to pour the water with a constant velocity into this river. And what we can do now is, after the simulation is done, we can run another simulation and just grab a portion of that simulation and up-res it. And what we're doing here is, instead of using a flat water line, we're now using the previous cached water sim as the boundary to begin and the end. So we're actually using the previous sim as a water line. And what that allows us to do now is we can now introduce an obstacle or a rock into our river. So now we're adding in a rock and we're re-simming it, but this time using the waterline tool, we're actually capturing the exact same influence of the water surface. Other handy uses for this is if we had to animate a character going down this, we could give the animators a pre-simulated version of the flip solver, and then they could animate their character. And then we can run another sim on top of that using the waterline feature that we developed for the ocean tools, where we're using our pre-simulated river system to drive the higher res system now with the animated character. So we're guaranteed to actually have a decent coupling between an animated character and the fluid to do the final sim where we can actually have a lot of sloshing and playing forward. So this is a very, very powerful tool. Here's another overhead of that same feature. So this is the pre-simmed flip saved out, and then we're using this, instead of the ocean surface, we're using this, the result of this to actually influence yet another flip fluid sim, but this time we're introducing a collider rock, and we're just simply doubling the resolution to get even more fidelity. So it's a very, very powerful tool. And so there's this notion of using guided fluid simulations. So guided fluid simulations can be, the guided surface can either be from an ocean toolset or from a previously simmed flip solver, or you know what, anything that you can think of. So anything that's a surface that actually has a decent velocity field you can use to influence your flip fluid surfaces. So very, very open set of tools. And finally, some more narrowband simulations of the flip river. Now, this is a really cool technology that we added into flip solvers. Is you can see down here in the lower right, we're basically using the collision or the surface field inside the flip fluid itself which is dynamically created every time step to build the bulk of the water. And there's a lot of engineering went into this, and to basically hold up that water. So this is where we're getting a tremendous amount of our performance, is by using narrow band. So you always want to turn on narrow band and always turn on receding. I know a lot of users sometimes turn off receding because they're fighting with it, but once you understand what it really is and what it can do, it's a great tool. And this is from yeah. Oh, and this is one of the examples that was done by one of our testers early on, using monsters with suction fluid, with a river canyon and a sculpting. I believe this is like a one evening experiment. And another thing that we did with narrow band is we can now distribute it. So, but in this case, we're showing a single tank. On the upper left-hand side is a full tank, and the lower right-hand side is narrow band. So you can see narrow band with open sail acceleration. Slightly different look to the simulation, but the performance is much, much faster because you're dealing with far fewer particles. So what we found out in production is you get 3 times the performance at 1/3 the memory. So what our users immediately did is they increased the resolution by 3 times to get the same performance. So, and to get but much, much higher quality fluids. So the idea with flip fluids is you want to get as high a quality as possible so you don't get those blobbies. In your water simulation, you want to get a lot more finer atomization in your base flip solver, and then you don't have to use foam as much to cover things up. So in this particular simulation done by an intern a couple years ago, you can see a bit of the blobbies happening here. I would say that you might want to go another step up in terms of flip resolution. So you're definitely looking at a pretty meaty machine if you're doing a single CPU solve. Maybe 64 to 128 gigs of memory would be a good place to work at. And I highly recommend when you're doing flip fluids, the very first thing you do is you run your sim at a low res to get it the bulk looking fine, and then you set it to the point where your machine can barely solve and try and stay out of swap. And then that's your final sim. Because I find out over experience and in time, once you're at a very high resolution with your flip sim, if you can keep it within the memory bounds of your machine, your performance is really not that much longer if you were to run it at a bit of a lower resolution. So you might as well go to the capacity of your machine right off the bat. Yeah. So here's a quick video of showing you some of the basics, and I'm going to just quickly hop through this really quickly. You can see here, this is the narrow band that we're getting out of our ocean tool set. And then if I go a bit further forward, let's see here. So this is the result. So when we take our ocean solve and we bring it into the flip solver using the shelf tool, you can see here we were actually building the correct, what are called packed particles to represent the top surface of the fluid simulation. And this here is really cool because this is actually off the shelf tool. What we get here is when we have our flip simulation, we're actually giving the particle fluid surface tool can take an existing surface. It can also take your flip simulation. And then there's controls within the particle fluid surface node that allows us to knit our flip sim, which is then surfaced directly inside of our ocean toolkit. So it's all supported inside of the particle fluid surface node. So we can actually knit very, very large ocean surfaces with very localized flip simulations, all with this single operator. And it gives you an awful lot of control. And as you can see, you do get a hit in terms of resolution, but because we have really awesome particle tools, I'd argue that it's pretty easy to unrefine those areas of the ocean, yet still keep all of your bulk look in place. So there's a lot of tools in here that we can do. And so again, here's another example of being able to take a localized flip sim, again with a particle fluid surface, and then knit it right inside of an ocean surface. So this means receding, and that waterline feature becomes even more important, because if we can drive the waterline into our flip simulation from our original ocean surface, you then get really, really nice nested localized flip simulations where you might have a breaching object coming on and it's knitting around the surface area around it. And pretty much this is all off the shelf while tweaking a few different parameters. And here's some examples of whitewater on a displaced ocean surface, not running flip sim. And here's some more examples of just a quick shot. And here's a quick example of narrowband colliding with a rigid body object. and some more breaching objects. So really easy to run these localized flip sims, and then if you're using reseeding around an ocean simulation, to sort of knit that in makes a lot of sense. Yeah, I'm done. And finally, in 17.5, we now can distribute our narrowband flip sims. So that means we can now scale beyond the current machine even better than we could in the past. So that concludes my presentation.